Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the fourth episode of 2020 Conversations, a series where important thinkers of our time discuss state of the world. In our longest episode to date, the indispensable Noam Chomsky gave us an account of the world. Chomsky is a renowned linguist, cognitive scientist, a philosopher, a professor emeritus at MIT, laureate professor at the University of Arizona. But to most of us outside of academia, Chomsky is known as an outspoken intellectual, dissident, a critic of the US government, and a proponent of socialist policies. He's a well-respected figure in left-wing activism and progressive movements. After watching a number of interviews he has given recently, I felt compelled to document his thoughts and arguments. Despite being 91 years old, his take on the world is still sharp, lucid, and relevant as ever. He starts by giving us an understanding of why the profit motive does not work for healthcare.
They follow good capitalist logic. You look at market signals, and there's no profit to be made in preparing for predicted and anticipated catastrophe. So they weren't interested. At that point, another possibility is the government could step in.
But the government is not allowed to step in because of a dogma that was instituted in the early 80s. Ronald Reagan was the spokesperson for it. Government is the problem, it's not the solution. Now, of course, that means government is the solution when the corporate sector and the wealthy are in trouble. But when it's the fate of the population that's concerned, government is the problem, not the answer. So there's a kind of a double whammy. Ordinary capitalist logic tells you the private sector is not going to do anything. The neoliberal plague tells you the government can't step in, so you're stuck.
I'm old enough to remember the terror of polio was ended by a government-initiated, funded project that finally led to the Salk vaccine, which was free, no intellectual property rights. Jonas Salk said it should be as free as the sun. Okay, that ended the polio terror, the measles terror. But the government couldn't step in because there's another particular aspect of the modern era, the neoliberal plague. You remember Ronald Reagan's maxim about how government is the problem, not the solution. So the government can't enter. There were some efforts, nevertheless, to try to prepare for this. Obama administration did make an effort to try to prepare for this. They contracted with a small company that was producing high-quality, low-cost ventilators. The company was bought up by a larger one, Covidian, which makes fancy, expensive ventilators. And they shelved the project. Presumably they didn't want competition with their own costly ones. Shortly after that, they turned to the government and said they wanted the contract ended. The reason was not profitable enough. So therefore, no ventilators. We have the same thing in hospitals. Hospitals are, under the neoliberal programs, are supposed to be efficient, meaning no spare capacity, just enough beds to get by. And in fact, plenty of people, me included, can testify that even the best hospitals caused great pain and suffering to patients even before this broke out. Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong have been doing a fairly good job of containing it. In Europe, Germany has the lowest recorded death rate of any country that has statistics, also Norway. And one reason is they did not follow this lunatic business-run principle of no fat in the system, just on-time delivery. May work for automobiles, doesn't work for health systems. That's that they can't have extra beds, they can't have extra diagnostic capacity. That wouldn't be efficient. And that means if anything goes wrong, Germany had excess capacity, diagnostic capacity, and they were able to do something to deal with the crisis. Because of this just-on-time efficiency concept that was guiding our privatized for-profit healthcare system. When anything hits out of the normal, it's just tough luck. And this runs across the system. That's called capitalism, and its particularly savage variant called neoliberalism, what we've been suffering from since Reagan. Notice that all of this is pre-Trump. Trump is taking failing lethal system and turning it into a monstrosity. But the roots were before him. Just think back at the reason why the pandemic occurred in the first place. Drug companies are following capitalist logic. They don't want to do anything. The neoliberal hammer says the government can't do anything the way it did in the past. You're caught in a vice. Then comes along Trump and makes it incomparably worse. But the roots of the crisis are pre-Trump. It was pretty striking to see what happened at the Davos conference this January. That's the meeting of the people who are called the masters of the universe, CEOs of the major corporations, big media stars and so on. They get together in Davos once a year, congratulate each other on how wonderful they are, put on a pose of dedicated humanists, totally devoted to the welfare of the people of the world. You're safe leaving your fate in our hands because we're such good guys. You look at the theme of the meeting, it's, we did bad things in the past. We now understand it. We're now opening a new era in which we aren't just concerned with stockholders, but with workers and the population. And it was pretty interesting to see what happened. There were two main speakers. Trump, of course, gave the keynote speech. Greta Thunberg gave the other speech. The contrast was fantastic. The first speech is this raving buffoon, screaming about how great he is. You can't even count up the number of the lies. Second speech is a 17-year-old girl quietly giving a factual, accurate description of what's happening in the world and looking these guys in the face and saying, you're destroying our lives. And of course, everyone politely collapsed. Nice little girl, go back to school. The reaction to Trump was particularly interesting. They don't like Trump. His vulgarity is incompatible with the image that they're trying to project of cultivated humanism. But they wildly applauded him, lustily applauded every word, because they know that he does recognize which pockets you have to fill with dollars and how to do it. And as long as he does that, as long as he serves his major constituency, they'll let him get away with the antics. In fact, like it because he mobilizes a crowd that'll back policies like his legislative achievements. Main one is a tax scam that pours money into the hands of corporate coffers and harms everyone else.
Given these issues that happened before the rise of Trump and Trump's continuation and exacerbation of these policies, how do we deal with this reality? Chomsky gave us some ideas. Let's have a listen.
The question is whether popular organizations will be able to impose enough pressure to make sure that this doesn't happen. And there are ways. Take the corporations right now are hiding their copies of Ayn Rand and rushing to the nanny state and asking for benefits from the public to overcome the results of their criminal behavior. What have they been doing for the last years? Profits have been going sky high. They've been indulging in an orgy of stock buybacks, which are devices to increase the wealth for the rich shareholders and for management while undermining the productive capacity of the enterprise at a huge scale, setting their offices somewhere in a little room in Ireland so they don't have to pay taxes using tax havens. This is not small change. This is tens of trillions of dollars robbing the taxpayer. Does that have to be the case? Take the current giveaway to corporations. It should be accompanied by conditionalities, a term we're familiar with from the IMF. They should be required to ensure that there will be no more use of tax havens. There will be no more stock buybacks, period. If they don't do that, with a firm guarantee, no money from the public. Is that utopian? Not at all. That was the law, and the law was enforced up until Ronald Reagan, who turned on the spigot, said, rob as much as you like, with Milton Friedman and other luminaries in the background telling him that's liberty. Liberty means rob the public massively by things like tax havens and stock buybacks. So there's nothing utopian about these conditions. It says let's go back to a period of pretty much regimented capitalism, which developed developed since Roosevelt was carried through till the 70s when it began to erode and with Reagan just ended. There should be further conditionalities. Should be working people, should be placed part of management, should be representatives of workers. Is that impossible? No, it's done in other countries. Germany, for example. There should be a requirement that they guarantee a living wage, not just minimum wage, a living wage. That's a conditionality that can be imposed.
And we should ask ourselves, considering the roots of the crisis, is that the world we want to live in? A world in which major decisions are handed over to unaccountable private institutions, which are committed only to greed, basically. Globalization doesn't have to be designed for the benefits of investors and corporate power. It can be designed for the interests of the general population. Worth remembering that it's not obligatory that human associations be determined by colors on maps. There are many forms of association, integration, common interests that have nothing to do with colors on maps. We see that right now in the refugee crisis, which, as the Pope pointed out, is not a refugee crisis, it's a moral crisis in the West that can be overcome. So in many dimensions, move towards an international system which is directed, designed for the interests of people, not private power. And it's not beyond reach. It's not easy to attain, but it's possible.
Next, Chomsky outlines the specific steps and things individuals can do to achieve the desired state as he outlined. Let's have a listen.
Now, we are trained in the official ideology to think that politics is a matter of showing up every 4 years, pushing a lever, and then going home. That's the official policy doctrine. And those who are saying, no, we can't vote for the lesser of two evils, are trapped by that doctrine. We shouldn't be. Sanders is correct. What's important is what the movement continues to do. Yes, we can take off a few minutes and try to stop a catastrophe, then go back to work. We shouldn't be trapped by the propaganda system, which tells us all that matters is one day in November. It matters. Right now, it happens to matter a lot at a level that it had never existed before in history. But when it's over, the work continues. Let's take a look at why Sanders didn't win the nomination. It's not just the manipulations of the DNC. Yeah, they didn't like him, they hated him. It's also something else. The left didn't appear. Sanders was hoping for a surge in the popular vote, especially among young people, very strongly in support of him. Didn't happen. It wasn't important enough to take a few minutes to go to the polls. California, where it basically didn't matter that much. The places where it mattered didn't happen. We should take a lesson from that.
The young people who worked hard for Sanders feel very depressed and think it was a failure, but they're mistaken. Every movement is started from zero. You take any serious social movement, abolitionism, women's rights, anyone, they go forward. They suffer setbacks, but they don't quit. They don't give up the first time you have a setback. You go on. You know, in fact, Sanders' campaign was an enormous success, a lasting success. He changed completely the arena of discussion and even policy formation in the United States. Crucial things that were regarded as ridiculous a couple of years ago are now in the center of attention. Universal health care, free higher education, workers' rights, decent wages. It's all in the center of attention, mainly because of him. That's a tremendous success. He also did something else. He showed you can run a political campaign successfully without relying on private wealth and corporate power. That's a break with a century of U.S. political history. These are great successes you can build from.
Let's go back to that J.P. Morgan memo that I mentioned. It actually advises that J.P. Morgan stop funding fossil fuels. It says that doing it causes reputational damage. What does that mean? That's advice to activists. It said, you keep wrecking our reputations, we're going to have to change policy. The banging on the doors, the protests, it has an effect. That's one of the reasons for the main theme at Davos last January. It was quite interesting. Corporate sector is saying, yeah, we were pretty rotten in the past, but now we're changing. We're going to be socially responsible, and even beyond socially responsible. We're going to go all out to help stakeholders, the communities, workers. We're really devoted to that now. It's the centerpiece of our commitment. Why? Because the peasants are rising with the pitchforks.
That's a good lesson, and it works.
Go after them. Go after their strangle. Force them, and create alternatives.
We've seen some very striking examples. Take, say, the Green New Deal. A couple of years ago, that was an object of ridicule if it was mentioned at all. Some form of Green New Deal is essential for the survival of humanity. Now it's part of the general agenda. Why? Activist engagement, especially Sunrise Movement. A group of young people acted significantly up to the point of sitting in congressional offices. They received support from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, other young legislators who came into office as part of the Sanders-inspired popular wave, another great success. Ed Markey, senator from Massachusetts, joined in. Now it's part of the legislative agenda. The next step is to force it through in some viable form, and there are very good ideas as to how to do that. Well, that's the way things can change. With a Biden presidency, there would be, if not a strongly sympathetic administration, at least one that can be reached, can be pressured. And that's very important. You look over the very good labor historian, I'm sure you know Eric Loomis, who's studied the efforts by working people to institute changes in the society. And he's pointed out, he made an interesting point. These efforts succeeded when there was a tolerant or sympathetic administration, not when there wasn't. That's a big one of many enormous differences between Trump, the sociopath, and Biden, who's kind of pretty empty. You can push him one way or another. This is the most crucial election in human history, literally. Another 4 years of Trump and we're in deep trouble.
We have two choices. We can say it's hopeless, it's all over. We can thereby contribute to assuring that the worst will happen. Or we can say accurately, there are opportunities. We'll grasp them. Whatever the probability of their success, maybe will help make a better world.
If you look back in recent history, there have been times where things looked really hopeless and desperate. I can go back to my early childhood, the late 30s, early 40s. It looked as though the rise of the Nazi plague was inexorable. Victory after victory. It looked like you couldn't stop it. It is the most horrible development in human history. Turns out, I didn't know that at the time, that U.S. planners were expecting that the post-war world would be divided between a U.S.-controlled world and a German-controlled world, including all of Eurasia. Horrifying idea. Well, it was overcome. There have been other civil rights movements, young freedom riders going out into the Alabama to try to encourage black farmers to go to vote despite the serious threat of being murdered and being murdered themselves. These were examples of what humans can do and have done, and we see many signs of it today, and that's the basis for hope.
Greatest achievements of humanity are gaining freedom and justice over a very broad range through constant struggle. The world is much better than it was even earlier in my lifetime, certainly far before. Those are really great achievements of popular struggle, which should never be stopped. And that not only prevent the worst outcome, but can lead to much better ones. I mean, a much better world is within grasp, with a realistic look at what's happening. No descending into illusions and pretenses. Take a look at the real world, the opportunities available, pursue them. You can get a better world.
On that inspiring note, the 4th episode is concluded. I hope this series has provoked you to think about the future critically and independently. In the next episode, we will feature a renowned figure with a very different ideological background who comes to a surprisingly similar conclusion. so please stay tuned for that. If you enjoy this content, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to leave a comment about who you'd like to see in this series in the future. Thanks, and see you next time.